The year is 1919. World War I has just ended, and American soldiers are returning home. The nation grapples with immense social and political changes, the rise of industrialization, massive immigration, and a fervent progressive movement advocating for social reforms. Among these reforms, a deeply divisive one stands out: the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. In our timeline, this era, known as Prohibition, lasted for 13 years, giving rise to speakeasies, organized crime, and a deep cultural schism, only to be repealed in 1933. Today, we delve into a what-if scenario, exploring a perpetually wet America. What if Prohibition never happened? Our point of divergence takes us to 1919. Imagine this: the political will for a nationwide ban on alcohol simply isn't strong enough. Perhaps key states refuse to ratify the amendment, or influential politicians, anticipating the immense difficulties of enforcement and the inevitable rise of a black market, successfully lobby against it. The temperance movement remains a powerful social force, advocating for moderation and addressing the societal ills often linked to alcohol, but its efforts are confined to local dry laws and public health campaigns, rather than a federal constitutional mandate. This absence of a national ban creates ripples across the fabric of American society, altering trajectories in ways both subtle and profound, leading to a vastly different unfolding of the 20th century. The cultural landscape would be shaped not by clandestine defiance, but by an open and evolving relationship with alcohol, influencing everything from urban planning to the very nature of social gatherings. This divergence isn't merely about alcohol, it's about the very soul of a nation at a critical juncture, poised between old traditions and an uncertain modern future. The immediate impact would be a vastly different 1920s. The Roaring Twenties would still be vibrant, a period of unprecedented economic growth and cultural effervescence, but crucially, it would lack the clandestine allure of speakeasies and the romanticized rebellion against a federal ban. Instead, nightlife thrives openly, with established bars, breweries, and distilleries operating legally and contributing to the open social landscape. Picture bustling saloons, elegant cocktail lounges, and charming neighborhood taverns as commonplace fixtures, serving as community hubs rather than secret hideaways. These public spaces would become fertile ground for new forms of social interaction, fostering a sense of shared experience that was fragmented by Prohibition. The very architecture of cities might evolve differently, with more prominent public houses and fewer hidden entrances, integrating these social venues seamlessly into urban life rather than pushing them underground. Think of grand beer gardens reminiscent of Germany, or sophisticated cocktail bars that are celebrated rather than rated, shaping urban aesthetics and social habits. The absence of a ban also means no constant cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement and illicit suppliers, freeing up public spaces from a pervasive atmosphere of illegality and suspicion. This could have fostered a greater sense of civic order and reduced the temptation for ordinary citizens to engage in illicit activities, thus subtly reinforcing respect for the rule of law. It would also likely lead to fewer instances of violence and criminal turf wars, which often spilled into public view in our timeline, creating a more peaceful urban environment. The cultural icon of the flapper might embody changing social norms in a less constrained environment, a symbol of newfound independence and modernity, rather than defiant lawbreaking. Her embrace of shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and a more liberal attitude would still signal a profound shift in women's roles, but it wouldn't be intertwined with the illicit thrill of a hidden drink. This would allow the flapper's image to evolve more organically, perhaps focusing more on her economic independence, her participation in public life, and her role in shaping new consumer cultures. Her rebellion would be against Victorian norms, not federal law, making her a symbol of genuine social evolution rather than a countercultural figure. This might lead to a more nuanced public perception of women's newfound freedoms, as they wouldn't be directly associated with lawbreaking, perhaps softening some of the social backlash against these changes. Women's newfound access to legal public spaces for drinking could also subtly alter gender dynamics in social settings, potentially fostering more integrated social scenes where men and women interact more freely and openly in public. This could accelerate the breakdown of traditional gender roles in social life and contribute to a more egalitarian society sooner, with less moral panic surrounding female liberation, and potentially impacting the timeline of subsequent feminist movements by allowing them to focus on issues of true equality rather than the right to drink. The Jazz Age, a truly American art form, would flourish in legal venues, fostering even wider public acceptance and perhaps influencing other art forms, with literature, theater, and cinema of the 20s and 30s evolving to reflect a less forbidden relationship with alcohol. This open acceptance could lead to more mainstream experimentation in cultural expression, potentially accelerating the fusion of music, dance, and storytelling in ways we can only imagine. Consider the development of new musical genres influenced by the open environment of clubs and dance halls, or cinematic narratives that integrate drinking culture without moralizing tones, perhaps exploring the nuances of social drinking rather than its illicit nature. This could lead to a more mature and diverse portrayal of alcohol in media, moving beyond simple prohibitionist propaganda or rebellious glamorization, allowing for more complex narratives about human experience and the social role of alcohol. New cultural phenomena, tied to legal bars and breweries, such as specific drinking rituals, social clubs centered around particular beverages, or even a burgeoning industry of cocktail innovation, could emerge and shape social interaction. The creative energy that was channeled into evading the law might instead be directed towards legitimate artistic and social endeavors, fostering a more transparent and perhaps healthier cultural relationship with alcohol. This could also mean a greater public discourse around responsible consumption, rather than the all-or-nothing approach enforced by prohibition, potentially leading to more effective public health campaigns down the line. Imagine a culinary scene where wine and spirits are celebrated as essential components of fine dining decades earlier, influencing American gastronomy in profound ways and fostering a sophisticated food and drink culture that might otherwise have been stunted. The American cocktail, instead of being born out of necessity to mask poor quality liquor, might have developed as an art form much earlier, celebrated for its craftsmanship and complexity, akin to European mixology, and becoming a source of national pride and an emblem of American ingenuity. The economic implications prove substantial. The vast profits that fueled organized crime in our timeline, derived from bootlegging and illicit alcohol production, would largely remain within legal industries. This could significantly curb the growth and influence of criminal syndicates like Al Capone's empire, preventing them from accumulating the vast wealth and power that allowed them to corrupt law enforcement and infiltrate legitimate businesses. Without this primary funding source, organized crime might remain more fragmented, less influential on a national scale, and confined to more traditional criminal enterprises like gambling or prostitution, without the added layer of alcohol-related violence and racketeering that characterized the Prohibition era. The vast networks of corruption that spread through police forces and political offices would likely be far less pervasive, leading to greater public trust in institutions and a potentially less cynical view of government. This would mean a healthier civic environment, less prone to the erosion of democratic principles that can come with widespread corruption. The energy and resources that Capone and others poured into building their criminal empires might never materialize, or would be redirected to less impactful ventures, preventing them from becoming the quasi-mythical figures they became in our history. This could also mean a different evolution of American popular culture, with fewer gangster movies and more narratives focused on other societal issues, shifting the archetypes of American anti-heroes from violent bootleggers to perhaps more subtle, white-collar criminals or urban racketeers, thereby changing the very landscape of crime fiction and media. Law enforcement, instead of being diverted to chasing moonshiners and shutting down speakeasies, would focus on traditional crimes, potentially leading to lower overall crime rates or at least a shift in the nature of criminal activity. This redirection of resources could allow police forces to specialize and become more effective in combating other forms of crime, fostering a more secure public environment. Imagine police departments focusing on violent crime, theft, or white-collar crime, rather than being bogged down in vice operations that often led to low conviction rates and public cynicism. This shift in focus could lead to earlier and more effective strategies for crime prevention and criminal investigation, shaping the future of American policing. It could also mean a less militarized and more community-oriented police force, as the need for large-scale, often violent raids on illicit operations would be absent. The public's relationship with law enforcement might be one of greater cooperation rather than distrust, fostering a stronger social contract and potentially reducing the instances of police brutality that often arose from the confrontational nature of prohibition enforcement. Furthermore, judicial systems would not be overwhelmed by alcohol-related offenses, allowing courts to focus on more serious crimes, potentially leading to greater efficiency and fairness in the justice system overall. This could have long-term positive effects on judicial precedent and the very structure of legal practice in America, allowing for reforms to be enacted earlier and more thoroughly, potentially even influencing the development of civil liberties and individual rights due to a less intrusive state. The tax revenue from alcohol sales, a significant source of income lost during Prohibition and sorely missed during the Great Depression, would flow into federal, state, and local coffers years earlier. This consistent stream of revenue, unencumbered by the costs of enforcing a failed ban, could allow for earlier investment in infrastructure, education, or other social programs, potentially softening the blow of the Great Depression when it arrived in 1929, or providing more resources for recovery. Imagine robust public works projects like the Hoover Dam or the Tennessee Valley Authority being funded more easily and potentially expanded, or improved educational facilities and expanded social safety nets funded by legitimate alcohol taxes. This additional financial stability might even prevent some of the more extreme economic hardship seen in our history, perhaps allowing the government to react more swiftly and effectively to the economic downturn, potentially mitigating its depth and duration. The resilience of the American economy might be stronger, leading to a faster recovery and fewer social upheavals during the crisis years, potentially averting some of the social unrest and political extremism that emerged during the Depression, and allowing for a more stable political landscape that might have had profound implications for future domestic and international policy, strengthening democratic institutions against populist pressures and extremist ideologies. Furthermore, the legal alcohol industry itself would continue to employ a vast workforce, from farmers growing grains and hops to distillery and brewery workers, truck drivers, and bartenders. These jobs, which disappeared or went underground during Prohibition, would contribute to a more stable employment landscape, particularly important during economic downturns. This continuous economic activity within the alcohol sector could also spur technological advancements in production, bottling, storage, or transportation, with potential spillover benefits for other sectors like refrigeration, logistics, and even agricultural innovation. Think of new cooling technologies developed for beer distribution finding application in food preservation, or efficient bottling processes influencing other consumer goods industries. The consistent demand would drive innovation in these related fields, potentially accelerating the development of the modern food and beverage industry and creating new avenues for economic growth. This broad impact on employment and innovation would weave alcohol production more deeply and positively into the fabric of the national economy, contributing to overall prosperity and perhaps even establishing American leadership in certain industrial sectors, such as food processing and cold chain logistics, thereby enhancing its global economic standing and influencing global supply chains and trade practices. Moreover, the absence of a ban could alter the trajectory of social activism. The temperance movement, deprived of its primary battleground, might pivot to other societal challenges that were also prevalent at the time. Perhaps its fervent energy would be directed toward combating emerging issues like drug trafficking, which could become a new profitable frontier for criminals in the absence of wet profits, or to broader public health campaigns unrelated to alcohol, such as sanitation, nutrition, mental health awareness, or even early environmental protection efforts. This shift could lead to unexpected social reforms in entirely different areas of American life, potentially addressing other societal problems with the same fervent dedication that the temperance movement demonstrated against alcohol. Without the singular focus on alcohol, the collective moral energy of the nation might have found other avenues for expression and reform, shaping a different landscape of social progress and potentially leading to earlier legislative action on issues that only gained traction much later in our timeline, such as child labor laws or worker safety regulations. The very nature of moral crusades in America might have diversified and become more nuanced, channeling reformist zeal into a wider array of societal improvements, perhaps even prefiguring the civil rights movements in different ways. By addressing systemic inequalities through alternative avenues, and laying groundwork for broader social justice efforts decades ahead of schedule, with a less fractured public discourse. Culturally, America's relationship with alcohol would be far less fraught. There would be no moral holiday from drinking, nor the subsequent fascination with cocktails that emerged post-Prohibition as people sought to mask the taste of often poorly produced illicit spirits. Instead, drinking habits might evolve more organically, perhaps mirroring European consumption patterns, where alcohol is often seen as an integral part of social life and culinary traditions rather than something inherently rebellious or sinful. This could foster a culture of moderation and appreciation, rather than one of illicit indulgence and often dangerous moonshine, leading to a more mature and responsible approach to consumption. The concept of responsible drinking might emerge earlier and be more widely accepted as a public health goal, with educational campaigns focusing on moderation rather than total abstinence, potentially leading to a more consistent long-term decline in alcohol abuse, guided by science rather than moralistic fervor, and fostering greater public understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral failing. The craft brewing and distilling movements, which experienced a massive resurgence in recent decades in our timeline, might have developed steadily throughout the 20th century, leading to a richer, more diverse alcoholic beverage landscape. This could mean a more sophisticated palate for American consumers, a wider array of locally produced beers, wines, and spirits, and a culture of appreciation rather than one of illicit indulgence. Imagine a vibrant network of local breweries and distilleries across the country much earlier in history, fostering regional identities and unique culinary traditions, and perhaps influencing agricultural practices across different states, as diverse grains and fruits are cultivated for specialized beverages. The social spaces where alcohol is consumed might also differ, fostering a different kind of communal interaction, perhaps more akin to European cafes or pubs, emphasizing conversation and community rather than secretive consumption. This could lead to a less binge-drinking-oriented culture and a greater emphasis on moderation, shaping social etiquette around drinking in a fundamentally different way. Furthermore, the absence of prohibition might have allowed for a more consistent development of culinary arts, as alcohol could be openly integrated into food pairings and gastronomic innovation, fostering a more sophisticated food culture across the nation and making American cuisine more diverse and renowned on the global stage decades earlier. The emergence of sommelier professions and mixology as a respected craft would likely have occurred far sooner, elevating the perception of alcohol from a mere intoxicant to a refined cultural element, contributing to a more sophisticated national identity and international reputation. Internationally, the lack of prohibition in the U.S. could also shift dynamics. European countries might find a more open market for alcohol exports to the United States, strengthening trade relationships and fostering greater economic interdependence. This could lead to a more vibrant exchange of goods and cultural influences, as American tastes are influenced by European products and vice versa. Conversely, American brands could enter the global market much sooner, influencing international tastes and contributing to cultural exchange through their products. Imagine American whiskeys or beers becoming globally recognized staples decades earlier, shaping international drinking habits and contributing to a softer form of American cultural diplomacy. The Americanization of global culture might have included a different alcoholic beverage landscape, fostering a more nuanced understanding of American culture abroad and paving the way for other American consumer goods to gain international traction. Diplomatic ties might be subtly affected by shared, rather than divergent, alcohol policies, potentially leading to smoother negotiations and alliances in other areas, as a point of friction or misunderstanding between nations is removed. The United States would present a more consistent and predictable trading partner in the global alcohol market, fostering greater trust and cooperation in an increasingly interconnected world. This could even lead to stronger alliances and a more stable global political climate, as economic interests align more frequently, potentially impacting the lead-up to World War II or the Cold War by fostering closer ties with European allies through shared commercial interests and cultural appreciation, rather than the moralistic stance that sometimes isolated the U.S. from certain international norms. However, this alternate history isn't without its potential downsides. The health campaigns of the temperance movement, focused on the dangers of excessive alcohol consumption, might have less impact without the dramatic backdrop of a federal ban. While the federal ban had many negative consequences, it did raise significant awareness of the societal costs of alcohol abuse, albeit in a highly polarized manner. Without this national experiment, public health initiatives related to alcohol addiction might develop slower or be less prioritized. Issues like alcoholism, drunk driving, and other health consequences of excessive drinking might not receive the same level of public attention or resources for prevention and treatment. There might be a greater prevalence of alcohol-related health issues, as the negative aspects of consumption are not as starkly highlighted or addressed through national policy, relying more on individual responsibility than collective public health efforts. The evolution of addiction science and treatment might also be delayed, as there would be less urgency for a societal response, potentially leading to more widespread, unaddressed cases of addiction and their associated societal burdens on healthcare systems and families, impacting public health outcomes for decades, and perhaps even creating a later, more severe public health crisis around alcohol, albeit one driven by data rather than moralism. This scenario could see a higher baseline level of alcohol-related illness and mortality in the mid-20th century. And while criminal networks might not find their primary funding source in alcohol, they would undoubtedly seek other illicit ventures, adapting to the absence of wet profits. The criminal underworld is nothing if not adaptable. They might turn to more widespread drug trafficking, illegal gambling rings, or other forms of racketeering, potentially creating new and unforeseen societal challenges. The fundamental human inclination towards illicit activity, for profit or power, would persist, simply finding different outlets. The focus of criminal activity might shift, but its presence would remain, perhaps even fostering new types of crime that were less prevalent in our timeline, like sophisticated financial fraud or large-scale smuggling of other goods across borders. The absence of prohibition doesn't eliminate crime, it merely rechannels it, and the societal cost might manifest in different, perhaps equally damaging, ways. The illicit networks that formed during Prohibition, though perhaps smaller, might still emerge around other profitable vices, potentially leading to a more diversified and complex criminal landscape that is harder to track or combat, demanding new and evolving strategies from law enforcement without the clear public enemy number one narrative of the Prohibition era, making the fight against crime more diffuse and challenging, and potentially less publicly understood. Furthermore, consider the cultural legacy of Prohibition. In our timeline, it's a cautionary tale about grand social engineering and unintended consequences. Without it, America would lack this specific historical lesson. How would that impact future policy decisions, especially those involving social control and individual liberties? The very concept of personal freedom versus public good might have developed along different lines without such a dramatic example of state overreach. The American psyche, shaped in part by the defiance and resilience of the Prohibition era, would evolve differently. Would there be a less ingrained suspicion of government intervention, or would other events fill that void? The absence of prohibition might mean a less colorful, but perhaps more stable, social history. It forces us to reflect on whether certain historical mistakes serve as crucial learning experiences, shaping national character and policy in unforeseen ways. The narrative of individual liberty versus collective good, so central to American political thought, might have found a different inflection point, or perhaps been less intensely debated, influencing civil rights and social welfare policies decades later. This lack of a monumental failure might alter the very understanding of governmental power and its limits within the public consciousness. The ripple effect could extend into the very fabric of American infrastructure and public services. With continuous tax revenue from alcohol, state and local governments might have had more consistent funding for urban development, public education, and even early healthcare initiatives. This could lead to better maintained roads, more advanced public schools, and a more robust public health system emerging sooner than in our timeline, perhaps lessening disparities between regions. The economic stability provided by a legal alcohol industry could also foster greater investment in research and development, not just within the beverage sector but in related industries, creating a more dynamic and innovative economy overall. Imagine more sophisticated agricultural science being applied to grain and fruit cultivation, or advanced manufacturing techniques developing faster due to continuous demand from the beverage industry. Even the political landscape might shift. Without prohibition as a wedge issue, political parties might have coalesced around different platforms. Would the progressive movement have maintained its momentum, or would its energy have dissipated without this grand moral crusade? Could new political alliances have formed, or existing ones been stronger, leading to different presidencies and legislative agendas? The absence of a national debate over alcohol might have allowed other social and economic issues to come to the forefront sooner, fundamentally changing the priorities and focus of American politics throughout the 20th century. This could have implications for issues like labor rights, environmental protection, or racial equality, potentially accelerating or delaying progress in those areas. In this what-if world, America navigates the 20th century without the grand social experiment of prohibition. It's a nation whose culture, economy, and legal system develop free from the profound, unintended consequences of a constitutional ban on alcohol. The spirits flow freely, and the social fabric, for better or worse, avoids a deep and divisive cultural battle. The absence of prohibition would certainly alter the course of American history, leading to a society that is both familiar and strikingly different from the one we know. The question then becomes, would the benefits of an unconstrained alcohol market and a shift in criminal enterprise outweigh the potential downsides of less focused public health attention on alcohol-related issues? This thought experiment highlights the intricate web of cause and effect in historical development, revealing how a single change can ripple through decades, shaping everything from social norms to economic prosperity and the nature of crime. It forces us to consider the often unintended consequences of even well-intentioned legislation and the complex interplay of culture, law, and economics.